Hello. Welcome to this episode of a Creative Approach podcast. I'm your host, Karen Poirier-Brody. My guest today is Nancy Nally. Alliteration is likely why Nancy Nally is known for her nose for news. Nancy's journalism beat is the craft world. She's no stranger to podcasting either. She helped host on the show the Paper Clipping Roundtable for a good while when it was an active broadcast. I met Nancy through the craft world and the events of AFCI, or the Association for Creative Industries, which used to be known as CHA, the Craft and Hobby Association. That's a lot of letters and a lot of words. I'm looking forward to today's show, where we can discover trends here and abroad and learn more about the job of a craft journalist and how Nancy found her path to her creative approach. By now, regular listeners know that I'm a passionate scrapbooker. I tend to do more digital pages these days, but I do like taking those supplies out and getting into the cutting, gluing, and dimension of paper storytelling. Right now, I'm creating a kit that I'll be taking with me to Dixon, California, to celebrate 2 days of cropping in honor of International, also known as National Scrapbook Day. I will purchase a few items at my local scrapbook store. I love to see how I can use supplies from my stash, even those more than 10 years old, to make pages with a contemporary look. My schedule is tight, but I'd love to make some handcrafted embellishments before I go. Now that my craft room is getting tidied up, I can find things quite quickly. I may be destroying the organization a bit as I try to put together my supplies. It's almost worse than packing for a trip abroad. Of course, there's more space. I do have my car that I could fill, although that would be just too much. The searching for the products I want has the benefit of telling me where I need to work on editing and classifying my stuff. I went online to look for current trends in colors, papers, and motifs. Of course, my kit will be way too large to use up in one setting, but I'm excited about putting it to good use. May 5th is not only Scrapbook Day, it's also Kentucky Derby Day, important in my house as my husband is from Kentucky and a Kentucky Colonel, and it's also Cinco de Mayo. And those are not the only celebrations. It's Burgundy Day. I believe that's the color, not the beverage. Celebrating with wine sounds good, though. Comic Book Day, Hoagie Day, and National Seeing Monarch Butterfly Day, and many other fun occasions mark May 5th, 2018. Most importantly, May 5th is Silence the Shame Day. Mental illness is far too common and so very treatable. Let's all speak up and encourage people who need help. We need to advocate for more resources also. I'd love to hear what you celebrated on May 5th. Did you find a creative outlet for telling that story? Join me now as we celebrate the creativity of crafts and learn more about Nancy Nally in today's conversation. Welcome to a Creative Approach podcast. I am so happy to welcome Nancy Nally to the show today. I think Nancy's one of the more fun people to talk to about creativity. Nancy is a columnist, journalist, and I've met her through the craft industry, and she's very familiar with podcasts. She used to co-host on the Paper Clipping podcast. And welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Karen. You set the bar a little high for me, though.
I always like to challenge you. And it is so great to talk to you, Nancy.
So lovely to talk to you, too.
We don't see each other that often. In fact, you didn't come to the Association for Creative Industries this year because you were off to Europe.
Yes, I missed Creativation in January and it was back to back with the Germany show. And after doing that for a couple of years in a row, I decided to give myself a break this year.
That sounds wise because that's a big trip. And yeah, that's a good way maybe to get into exactly what it is that you do and how it is that you're coming to the shows and what your career is and your blog.
Yeah, actually, we currently own three, well, more than that, but three craft industry related websites through our company. We have Scrapbook Update, which is the one that most people are familiar with. It's trade news for the crafts industry. And that's the main one that brings me to the trade shows. And then we have Craft Critique, which is formed, a long time ago. And then we purchased it a few years back. And that's craft reviews and things like that. And then we recently launched Chasing Dust Bunnies, which is a lifestyle blog that is going to have a craft section on it. And then I also do freelance writing and things like that that are crafts related. And we also do some social media consulting and things like that in the crafts industry as well.
So pretty busy.
Yes, I do keep busy.
And when you're being, this is probably, as a journalist with really your beat is crafty people. What are the sorts of, I think the listener would probably like to know, what sorts of crafts do you focus on mainly? Are you really general, or can you tell us a little bit about that?
I actually do, between all of the sites that I've got, I actually do a little bit of everything. Of course, people think of me as a scrapbooker because I do Scrapbook Update, and scrapbooking is in the title, and it tends to focus on scrapbooking on that site. But between Craft Critique and Chasing Dust Bunnies and then just my personal interests, I do pretty much everything, from the paper crafting to, a lot of, paint related stuff, with half my studio filled with acrylic paints of various types. And, over the years, I've done cross stitching, sewing, all sorts of stuff. I've been a crafter my whole life. And when you've crafted that long, you accumulate a lot of skills.
For sure. And there's always trends in crafts. In fact, you're probably the best person to say. I mean, knitting, it looks like embroidery might be having a resurgence.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. I've been picking up my needle again and dabbling again.
And in going to the shows and reviewing things like you do, what would you say are some of the really hot crafts right now?
Food crafts is probably the hottest segment of the industry right now. Everybody's getting into the candy making and the decorative cupcake making and all of that. That section is hot, hot, hot. Although a lot of people don't initially think of it as a section of the crafts industry. And then, of course, the embroidery is getting hot. Weaving was kind of making a little bit of a comeback there. There's been some interesting things making a resurgence. The 70s and 80s have been getting hot. So all those crafts that were hot during those periods.
Macrame.
Macrame, exactly, have been making a comeback.
I wonder if, and probably influencing fashion too. I mean, fashion in a way is a craft as well.
Yes, and it's actually circular because you actually see the influences in the styles that come out of the fashion and home decor market, and they filter down to the crafts market, partially because a lot of crafters are using their crafts to emulate the stuff that they see in the home decor and fashion market. You see people trying to sew the clothes that they see in the high-end fashion, or, you see for instance, farmhouse decor got really hot because of the TV shows on HGTV. And then you see it filter down into the crafts industry because everybody is trying to DIY that style. So the trend filters down from those industries into the DIY as people try to emulate it with a budget, basically.
Right. And then, well, in Europe, is that, do they follow similar trends? Is there something else going on there versus here?
It is actually striking how different some of the trends can be in Europe, because they're into almost some entirely different crafts. And then some of the ones that we're into over here don't filter down as well. Like, for instance, the planner trend that in the paper crafts industry has been huge here for several years is just starting to filter into that market. And over there, like, you see things like they're huge into things like decoupage that like barely make a ripple over here.
Oh, but that's the 70s trend probably doing a resurgence, so maybe we'll see it.
Well, excited. I've been seeing it for several years over there, and it's just like something, and they're huge into molding things over there. Anything that you can mold, like you walk into a craft department over there in like one of the major craft stores. Like I was in one in Paris after the show, and they have a massive display of all these molds and stuff to make plaster molded stuff.
Cool.
Whereas over here, we buy most of that stuff pre-molded. We don't mold it ourselves. We just go into Michael's and we buy the pre-molded little plaster figurines to paint or whatever. They mold it themselves over there.
Uh-huh. Well, that's cool.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the interests are different.
Yeah, well, that would be fun to see because I like, there are those really easy molding materials for, when you want to copy textures and make things that are fun.
I know. It was like, oh, I could have gone nuts in that department in Paris. I was traveling with nothing but a carry-on, and I was like, I want to take it all home. Like, we don't have any of this at, the stores I shop at home. I want to take it all home with me.
Indeed. And sometimes some interesting products. I guess there was one I saw a while back where there was a type of material, plasticized type of material that you put cotton and stuff in. It wouldn't stick to metal and you could use it to mold things and make sculptures. I'm not sure if that ever really caught on here because I don't remember
that
seeing
one
much
doesn't ring a bell. One of the interesting things is that really jumped out at me focusing on the paper crafts the first couple times that I was over there.
Yeah.
Is even though they're like into scrapbooking, just you would think in a similar way that we're into scrapbooking, the style is different.
How would you say that?
Like there's a regional style of, especially the stuff coming out, the patterns of the papers. They tend to focus on smaller patterns. Like over here, like if we do a floral, you look at like, for instance, the floral papers that Graphic 45 released at AFCI this year at Creativation. They're
hard to get used to saying that, isn't it?
I know. I'll probably be saying it till I'm dead because it's just
CHA was part of our culture for so long. So, anyways, right. Getting back to Graphic 45 and their patterns.
They're very detailed designs, but they're big on the piece of paper.
Right.
And you see that with most of the floral designs that are released by U.S. companies. The flowers are big and bold. You could say that they're just like Americans, we're effusive and bold and, and the floral patterns like that you see released by European countries, by companies based in Europe, for the most part are these teeny tiny delicate flowers.
So
they're that
chintzy
English
sort of look. They're
that little English teeny tiny floral things. Like I said, it's almost that European sense of reserve translated into the design versus our big, bold, out there, in your face florals. It's fascinating to look at because it's like you walk around the show floor and it's striking you that, oh, these are like really different. And then you realize after seeing a bunch of them, what that difference is. It's that they're the smaller scale, the more, and they're gorgeous. And it's totally different than what you see over here.
Right. Well, what about like the graphic and linear trend we have here? And also just tons of black and white. I mean, if I see another person with a black and white tie, there's like colors disappearing. Most
of the stuff that I've seen coming out of that market in the paper craft side is much more vintage themed. Which is weird because, of course, Europe is known for that modern architecture style and everything these days. The the scrapbooking and paper crafts type stuff that I can recall off the top of my head skews more towards that kind of vintage style that they're producing in that market, which is interesting.
Yeah, we had a trend towards that. Maybe that's going to be coming back here too. Never know if that'll translate.
I'd love to see that.
It's beautiful usually. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I like that vintage look. How about like color trends and things, especially even in other crafts besides scrapbooking? Are there any things that struck you as being interesting or different?
Well, I think since so much of it tends to skew more towards the vintage coloring, a lot of it tends to skew towards the vintage coloring because of the vintage styling that jumped out at me. And so, because those two go kind of hand in hand. Yeah. You're not going to have a line that's vintage style that has, primary red in it. And
maybe not. So all the big bold colors that are like Pantone colors of the year are being translated as something softer and more pastel over there.
Yeah, it's a lot of pastels, a lot of those vintage tones. And as a vintage loving girl, it's like Christmas walking around. It's like, beautiful vintagey chalk painted furniture. And that was another one of the things is before the chalk paint craze hit over here, I saw it all over the place on the show floor over there in Frankfurt at Creative World. That was, they're nuts about it. And so, so that before it filtered over here, that was a big craze over there.
Well, it was isn't Annie Sloan British? Or am I wrong? Yeah. So
I believe so, yes.
Probably got it. She was a big proponent and has a line of chalk paints that.
Yeah, but
everybody has them now, of course.
Yeah, there was all sorts of companies on the show floor over there with those paints. Oh. And big, it was a big craze. I saw that one coming after having seen it on the show floor over there. And, it very much fits with that vintage antique vibe and also with the whole, rehabbing, recycling kind of thing too.
Yeah. So the DIY trend is still very strong as far as redecorating and remodeling and things as far as people making their own versions or just doing it themselves. So, which I was going to say something about craft people have so many more opportunities now and in all areas to express themselves.
Oh, yeah. There's so much available that we can, customize everything and make it our own down to the nth degree if we're just willing to put the time into it.
So true. And then I think I saw a lot of things, hinted at over the past couple of times at the Association for Creative Industries of working with metal and texturizing things to do with metal. Is that something you noticed in Europe?
Yeah, somewhat. Mm-hmm. Okay. The metal craze, the metallic finish craze is so huge over here. First it was the shiny gold and now we've switched into some of the other shades of it. But it's definitely still that metallic finish is hot. And, I'm staring at three different things right now in my studio that are in various different metallic shades that I've made over the course of this trend.
Yeah, I'm just looking up and I see some metallic finishes up in a little cabinet that I have of paint colors. And I think, I think I'm into that too. Just our whole environment reflects that. Some listeners might be into, rubber stamping has been one of those things that goes along with card making and scrapbooking. And I was wondering do you see is that trend continuing or as a popular one, or is that sort of taking more of a back seat these days?
That is a very timely question because several of the major chains have just gutted their selection, the acrylic stamps, and are going back to the wood-mounted stamps. You know, Michaels and Hobby Lobby both have significantly cut back and are going to wood-mounted instead, is my understanding.
So using the rubber, because it might it tends to give better impressions, I think.
Yeah.
And and
I don't know, the paper crafting in general has been decreasing as a segment of the industry, but it still has its hardcore fans.
Yeah, well, I think there's always people who are going to want to make their own special cards. And of course, some of us just like telling more of the story with our pictures. So I imagine
when I started working at the scrapbook store in Jacksonville, this was back in 2000. It was a store it was a scrapbook store, but before it had been a scrapbook store, it had been a rubber stamp store.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of where we're headed again, is that it's going to be the rubber stamp. I think we're going back to where scrapbooking is an add-on to the rubber stamp craze for the handmade cards and stuff. I really think that for most people, there are some people who craft simply because they love to just create. There's some people who do that. But I think there's a huge segment of people who walk into a craft store or a sewing store or whatever, motivated by a practical purpose because they want to do something that they couldn't do unless they craft it. It's either because the product that they want isn't on the store shelves because they can't find the color or whatever it is that they want or need, or they can't find the size that they want because they need something to fit in that piece of wall and they can't find something the right size, so they're going to make it. Or if it's because the thing that they want is out of their budget, so they're going to make it instead. And I think a lot of crafting is just driven by practical purposes, and the stamping fits into that because it is, you know, card making and you're creating something that's useful.
Right. I think that's true. I didn't know I was going with that thought. That happens.
You know, despite the fact that I work in the industry and I just love to sit down and play with stuff and create, I am an eminently practical crafter. Virtually everything I create, even though it ends up on my blog, is something that I designed and created because I have a purpose for it, whether it's the shadow box that I created for a sponsored blog post because I wanted to show off my vacation pictures, or whether it's a scrapbook page to record my pictures of my kid, that I want to share, or whatever. I very rarely create something that I don't have an intended purpose for.
That's true, I think, a lot of times. I mean, sometimes I do just play, and that's fun, but you're right. Mm-hmm. Doing things for a purpose probably motivates a lot of what I do, too.
Yeah.
I have to agree with that. Now, I wanted to go, so we talked a little bit about exploring, the scrapbook update or the craft updating. Now, you do reviews, and those are things, what kind of things would we find on your site? And remind me of the name of the site.
Okay, I have Scrapbook Update, Craft Critique.
Craft Critique. That was the one I was going to ask about. What kind
and then we have Chasing Dust Bunnies.
And that was the lifestyle one. What are we going to find on the Craft Critique? What sorts of products are you there?
All sorts of different craft products. One of the more recent ones was we did a side-by-side review of a bunch of different travel sets of watercolors. I did a review of the zinc printer that I used when I traveled last year. It's just random stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't publish very often because those reviews are pretty exhaustive and they take a decent chunk of time to do.
Well, that's good, though. If they're pretty exhaustive, they're probably a good resource for the listener. So good that you mentioned that. That's a good thing. And then the lifestyle one, I assume, is even more general.
Yeah, in the last month, I think I've written everything from talking about my plans to organize my garage to a review of the Saint Chapelle Church in Paris, digital scrapbook pages. I've got an article going up soon with a paint project on it. All
sorts of stuff. That sounds great. Sounds like a fun read. And I guess where I wanted to go here was to find out, how did Nancy Nally get started in all of this? I mean, what kind of, when you were growing up, or did you have to make a lot of things? Were your parents avid crafters? I mean, where did things begin?
Well, I grew up around crafting and everything. I think the first craft that I remember was having one of those little metal weaving looms that you could make pot holders on.
Oh, yeah.
Having one of those when I was really little. And, my grandmother she did all the knit and crochet. And then my mom, I had more handmade clothes when I was growing up. That was back in the day when it was actually cheaper to sew than it was to buy.
Not always the case now.
Which it's not anymore. And yeah, so, my brother and I had, handmade clothes and back in the day. And,
well, I'm going to interrupt here and say it could still be less expensive if you sew like my grandmother did. I mean, if she used to go to the thrift shop and salvage everything from buttons and zippers and even good fabric, and then we'd end up with some clothes that, grandma made that didn't really cost hardly anything. But
oh, there you go. There you go.
And that's that whole recycle sort of thing that people are into. So I don't think everyone should think that making their own clothes necessarily, it takes a lot more work to do it that way, but you can certainly put your ingenuity hat on and go for it, and may end up with things that are super attractive that don't cost as much.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
But getting back.
I just grew up around it. I said my mom taught me to sew when I was really little, and, she made all my Barbie doll clothes, and then I started making them. And, my aunt and my grandmother owned a quilt shop for a while when I was in high school. And then, I got married and had a house of my own to decorate and started making stuff for the house. And then I got into the scrapbooking hardcore and started working I was a photographer. I've been a serious photographer since I was in, a freshman in high school. I got an SLR. And so when scrapbooking came around, I was all over that, and started working in a scrapbook shop. And then I quit doing that so that I could, when I got pregnant and had my daughter, and right around the time I was going stir crazy sitting at home with my daughter was the time that blogging kind of started to hit the internet. And I have a BA in communications. I can, so I was it seemed like a natural thing for me to write. And so I just started blogging to kind of keep myself from going crazy.
But you kind of tied everything together. And so I was wondering just how you got to be more, of a journalist. And that kind of explains it with the photography and the interest in crafts. And then you just started investigating the craft world. Is that how you're?
Yeah, well, it's just kind of my nature, I guess. I just have that kind of analytical nature.
Uh-huh.
And I just started looking at it differently than other people. And when I started writing about it and I started realizing that people wanted to read that, then I just kept writing it. And
that sounds like a good way.
Yeah. I mean, you pay attention to what you realize that, hey, wait a minute, nobody else is writing this stuff and I'm interested in it. And it's always intrigued me because people think of crafts as a hobby, and it is. But to get that hobby to your local store shelves, I mean, there's a massive industry behind that, and it works just like any other industry. And very few people were writing about that. And I found that intriguing.
Yeah, the whole thing about sustainability, suppliers, manufacturing, shipping, political issues, taxes. There's a whole lot of areas that people don't think of in terms of what's involved in the whole craft business.
Right. And I mean, as a business, you need certain information to be able to run your business well. And most industries have, sources of that, business information. And Scrapbook Update is part of that, system for the crafts industry.
Right. I think that was one thing I brought up, one of my sort of passions in sustainability. And I was thinking about that in terms of Europe, who I think tend to have an eye on that sometimes more than we do. And
Definitely.
I was wondering if you saw any sort of trends in that or emphasis in that when you went to the show in Germany.
Let me see. Well, I mean, anytime you set foot in Europe, it becomes obvious that, that they're much more invested in those concepts than we are, from the investment in mass transportation to just, the ubiquitous presence of recycling bins. They won't sell you water in a bottle, all this stuff.
Right.
But on the show floor itself, nothing jumps out at me.
No sort of ecological. I mean, there was a trend for a while, like eco paints and things like that.
Nothing that jumps out at me.
Mm-hmm.
But I obviously, in the time that I'm there, I don't have the time to cover everything. I'm covering mostly the big vendors.
Sure.
And the American presence at the show. And so nothing jumps out at me from those particular companies.
Okay, fair enough. But you're right about, I think, that you do have that sense in Europe that people are, that ecological thing, certainly in terms of, as you said, transportation and limits maybe on bottled water. And you
just kind of feel like you can just kind of feel the entire different attitude towards it.
Uh-huh. And let me think. So in terms of, when you decided on a BA in communications, did you have some, you finished high school? What was it? Just that you liked the idea of writing from when you were young, or did you have particular goals in mind? Because it sounds like a lot of these things just happened.
They did. To be honest, they did. Actually, what happened is I originally went to college at Michigan State to be in their James Madison program, which is a political program.
Uh-huh.
And it has several different majors under that James Madison College program. I was originally, if I remember correct, an international relations major, and then I switched to social relations. And after 3 years, I ended up leaving Michigan State because my husband graduated and we wanted to get married, and I had to follow him to where he was getting a job. So then I transferred, and when I transferred and you transfer credits, it becomes an entire mess. And
True.
So I ended up, it was like the BA in communications was the path of least resistance to getting a degree. And so I ended up with that degree with no real plan for how to use it, which was a big mistake. But,
But it all worked out in the end.
It all worked out in the end.
But I'm just struck by the fact of so much serendipity factors into what a lot of people end up doing.
It actually ended up being a big joke because it was like 10 years later after I graduated that I started becoming a freelance writer. And I've done freelance writing now, not only in the crafts industry, but I freelance wrote for a genealogy magazine for a while. I freelance wrote for a tech publication for a while. And it was all, and my husband looked at me at one point. It was right around the time I paid off my college loans. He looked at me and he's like, look, you paid off your college loans and you're finally using your degree.
Well, not everyone says that or does that. That's true.
Perfect timing.
Yeah.
So, it just, when I graduated college, I actually became a freelance genealogist.
Ah, another one of my passions.
Yeah, I got certified as a record searcher because this was before the age of the internet.
Uh-huh.
And, back then people actually had to pay somebody to go down to the local courthouse and search records or go out into a cemetery and take pictures for them or whatever.
Oh,
And
they still do. I mean, if you really want to
but
go in
not as
depth,
much.
but not as much.
much.
You're right.
Now you can get 90% of that stuff just logging on to ancestry.com and paying them for it.
Right.
And so I did that for a while.
Did you do your own genealogy?
Oh yeah, I'd been doing it since I was probably in junior high. My grandparents one of my sets of grandparents were really into it. And so they would take me to the genealogy library with them, and they taught me to research my other side of my family while they researched that side of the family. So they helped me research my other parents' side of the family while they researched their side.
Well, that's cool that it was a family interest. I mean, I don't know that anyone in my family was terribly interested till I started doing it. So.
Oh yeah, I think my grandma had her lineage tracked back to the Vikings or something ridiculous. I don't know.
Well, and now you can trace all that back with your genetic genealogy if you do Ancestry or 23andMe.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. To be honest, when it started to become so computerized and everything, it's like it was no fun anymore. It was too easy.
You like the challenge.
I did. I liked the challenge of trekking through cemeteries and scrolling through microfilm, and I liked the challenge.
Well, that sounds like, I'm thinking here, let me get my thought here. I was thinking, are in a way an investigative reporter when it comes to the craft industry. And that kind of goes with this nature of doing the investigations for genealogy, I think. Doesn't that kind of tie it all together?
It is. I do like hunting down a good mystery. I really do. And whether it's a family history, who the heck did that guy marry, or whether it, what happened to that company, or I like a good mystery. I like, solving a puzzle. And, with the internet, you can do a lot of research, and I have a curious mind by nature, I guess.
Well, I think that's very helpful when it comes to crafts. I mean, trying to invent, of course, now things on Pinterest are all very obvious, but you still really, to get some good clues, you have to have that mind in order to come up with something really creative, to investigate different angles and find out ways that you could maybe tell your story or present your piece of art in a new, unique way by combining, ideas from the past. We don't all just start with the totally cold blank slate.
Yeah, I mean, it is the flip side. Creativity is almost the flip side of curiosity, because creativity is almost the curiosity of, well, what happens if I do this? When you talk about crafts, you've got paint, and you're like, well, what happens if I mix these two colors? What happened, what will this technique do if I put it on this surface? To a certain extent, that is what a lot of the creativity in the industry is.
Exactly. Yeah. From the industry point of view and even on a personal level. Well, in fact, that leads to, I often end these interviews, which has been very fascinating learning what you do and the whole process of how you got there, but just to some of your thoughts on creativity in general. I always like to hear what people have to say.
That is all. It's funny because as somebody who works in this industry and whose life is so consumed by crafts, creativity is always an interesting challenge for me. My creativity is always so purpose driven that I don't have that sort of creativity where I sit down with this image in my head that, oh, this is what this project is going to look like when it's done. It's more like, okay, I want to do X, and then it kind of evolves as I go. And I live in awe of these friends that I have that can, just sit down and know what they're going to do and execute it. And it looks like what they envisioned when they're done. I have no ability to do that. I have no ability to do that. But like I said, for me, it's a process, and I start out with a starting point, and who knows where I end up.
You still have an objective in mind.
Yeah.
You're project driven. So, but how it will really end up is somewhat of a mystery. That sounds cool, though. That's the fun part.
Yeah, it is. It's, you just dabble and play and figure out along the way. And sometimes you end up with happy accidents, and it turns out better than you could have imagined. And sometimes you take unexpected detours.
But those are adventures and fun for the creative spirit.
That's right.
Well, we're enjoying hearing about your creative approach. And I think maybe we should review again the places where folks can go to find you. So maybe you could give us those.
Okay. We have scrapbookupdate.com and craftcritique.com are the crafts websites. And then we have the lifestyle blog, chasingdustbunnies.com.
Great. Well, I have enjoyed catching up with you again, and it's been a fun conversation. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Karen.
Great. Hopefully it won't be too long before we see you again. Thanks again for being with us, and talk to you sometime soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening. Show notes from today's episode of A Creative Approach podcast, where you can learn more about Nancy Nally, are available on the webpage www.acreativeapproachpodcast.com. Please join our Creative Approach Facebook page and the A Creative Approach Facebook group page too. There on the group page, we welcome your questions and feedback on the show. Affiliate links can be found at a Creative Approach podcast website. I hope you're a subscriber to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again for listening. Please join in future conversations where I hope you will find inspiration to make things, tell your story, and explore a creative approach to life.